Good evening. We're doing business this evening as the District Advisory Building Committee. It is Thursday, November 12th, and we'll be doing roll call. I guess not. Sorry. Paul Stevens.
Here.
Mark Belfons.
Here.
Abigail Fuller.
Here.
Councillor Ray.
Here.
Matthew Winch.
Here.
Brad Post.
Present.
Board Member Figdor.
Here.
And Jessica Marino.
Here.
And Councillor Costa.
Here.
Great. So welcome, everybody. Before we begin, I just wanted to recognize that this will be probably Councillor Costa's last DABC meeting with us all. And we'll be appointing somebody, I would assume, from the council to take Justin's place. But nobody can take Justin's place, as we all know. But I want to thank you, Justin, very much for being my co-chair and for all of your service. We greatly appreciate it. And I think that you'll hopefully stay in touch and keep your finger on the pulse. And I don't know if anyone wants to say anything to Justin before we get going here. Or...
Thanks, Justin.
Go ahead, Paul.
You've done a lot for our schools, for sure.
Thank you.
I'm sorry to see you go, Justin, that's for sure.
Well, thanks, Paul. And we should note, too, it is also going to be Mark's last meeting.
Oh, yes, that is right. I'm still crying, so don't. Well, thank you. So I'm just bringing up the documents now. Does everybody have the board documents that Emily sent out?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to start with the, well, I guess we don't have it on the agenda, the meeting minutes for the last meeting that we had. So we will skip that for now. And
no, we have them, Sarah.
Oh, it is there?
Yep.
I don't see it. Sorry. Could you please tell me the date on that, Superintendent?
It was October 15th, 2020.
Okay. Thank you very much. Do I have a motion to accept the meeting minutes for October 15th, 2020? Okay. Mr. Lynch, seconded by Mr. Belfons. Is there any errors or omissions? Okay. Seeing none. All those in favor of approving the meeting minutes from October 15th, please indicate.
Aye.
Okay. Vote unanimous with all those present. And moving into next item, which would be the discussion around the Green New Deal referendum question C update. I'm not sure if Superintendent, you want to kick it off or have Mark or Lisa?
No, let me kick it off. That's I appreciate that. I also want to recognize that in addition to our Harriman team of Mark Lee, Lisa Solon, and Emily Waugh, that we have with us Bill Stockmeyer and Aga Dixon from Drummond Woodsum. Drummond Woodsum is the school board's attorneys, and in the packet you have a memo that they wrote for us a couple weeks ago that the board members have seen previously, that sort of analyzed, and obviously it's a couple weeks since then, so some things have evolved. That was written prior to the passage, and so there's been some additional clarification around issues that you will see play out as we as we talk today about what we believe the status is. So the way that we've organized this today is that we will spend the bulk of the time trying to make sure that we bring visibility to what we believe the situation is now for the 3 schools with the passage of the Green New Deal. And we've started to think through what are the next steps in terms of how to organize, given the implications of the Green New Deal for the work going forward. And so that's the second part of the agenda today. In some ways, where we are today is not unlike where we were back in February, where, if you recall, we had received the projections for what the construction costs would potentially be, and we obviously came to realize that we didn't have the the amount of money needed to be able to do the projects as they had originally been envisioned. And so with your guidance, the team worked for the past 6 months to make adjustments based on that. And so, we're in a very similar situation today in that, we were virtually done with the project design. The Harriman team was in the process of putting together the specifications for the blueprints, and we were preparing to go to the board. Yesterday they would have had a first reading of a resolution to go out to contract bid, and we put that on pause. So I think for the DABC to think about today is sort of like we're back in that same place, and we need to make some decisions about how do we proceed from here. So I think our goal today is to provide you some background information on the Green New Deal and tee up some options as we've thought of them, but we'll concede up front that those are not the only options. Those are the ones that we've conceived, and that as a group we can move that work forward from what it is that we have on the paper today. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Mark to sort of just do the background on this, and then when we get into the discussion, I know that Bill and Aga will also help us to understand some of the details around the Green New Deal and our options as they present themselves. So with that, I am going to turn it over to, I believe, Mark or Lisa. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we're going to do a little tag teaming here. Thank you, Javier. And so good evening, everyone. We'll try to not go over too much of the ground that has already been covered, but we'll try to again, bring everyone up to the same level of understanding of where we are today. And so I think Lisa's going to try sharing her screen right now. She has the PowerPoint. We'll go through the slides here.
I seem to be enabled to be able to share my screen.
I will.
I don't know. Perfect. All right, here it comes. Hopefully you can see the opening slide that says DABC meeting.
Yep.
Yes.
Yep.
Perfect.
All right. So we'll again, we just have a quick update on sort of the foundational understanding of the what the Green New Deal question C was, and sort of its impact on the project, and then we'll sort of look a little bit at what we had envisioned as next steps, and really it's to allow for a lot of questions and information to sharing. So with that, next slide. All right, and the next one. And so as we talked prior to this slide should seem very familiar to everyone. We, I think, covered a lot of this on our last meeting, but the impact of question C is in two areas as it relates to the BFOF project. The first is on the construction side, in that there's a requirement for contractors to hire a certain percentage of workers as apprentices, and that potentially will have an impact. Most contractors don't have a quota of apprentices that they are required to hold on to, so there may be an impact to the labor for a construction project, because they, in terms of thinking about the crews that they need to staff a project and how many of those they rely on as experienced laborers versus apprentices. So the second item in the construction category is as it relates to the wage rates have to comply with state and local fair wage rates. And as I think everyone here recalls, we put in language in the LICEF project to make sure that we were complying with the Department of Labor, State of Maine Department of Labor fair wages. And so that's kind of a step that we had gone beyond the required procurement. And so we don't think that has a significant impact to the project. And then the third item under construction is the requirement that employees undergo OSHA training. And most contractors require that of their employees anyway. And so again, we don't think that has a significant impact on the project or its costs. The other side of the coin is on the design side of it, and what the Green New Deal requires in that regard. And what the Green New Deal does is it modifies the existing city green building code, and it increases some of the requirements that are currently on the books for the city's ordinance. The one that we think has perhaps one of the biggest impacts is that the requirement for the project to exceed the energy requirements that are currently established as part of the Green Building Code. So, and that ultimately, we'll go into some more detail on that, but it changes the standard that we're using from the 2010 year standard to the 2019 standard, as we understand the terminology of the Green New Deal. The second piece of the design requires that roofs comply with the Better Roofs program, and that 15% of the roof be set aside to be solar ready or vegetative. And so that 15% needs to be clear of any shading. There is an exception that you could use an adjacent structure if you didn't have some that was clear of shading, but the 15% isn't a significant amount of the total area of the roof, and so we think that most of the three building projects that we have as part of the BOF would not have a significant challenge in meeting that. At some point in time, and Drummond and Woodson can sort of opine on this in more detail, but we don't think that it requires the structural upgrades be done at the time of the project, but that in the future, if and when you go to place the new equipment and solar installation on a roof, most of them were met the loads of the roof at the time that they were designed, but don't meet currently prescribed roof loads. And so when you put more load onto a roof, then you have to bring them up to compliance with current code. So that one, again, the Better Roofs program, we don't think has a significant impact. Next slide. One of the things I think we talked about last time as this group is when would this take effect? And I believe it was Councilor Ray that pointed out that it would take effect 30 days from the certification of the vote. And so that is in early December. And so, and then there was some discussion around, does it allow for exemptions? And while there's some provision that says that the Director of Planning for the city can exempt the requirements on the grounds of infeasibility from a technical perspective. So that's the sort of terminology that's used in it, but there is no sort of explicit exemption for a project already in design or some grandfathering clause. So that's that was again part of this is a recap of our conversation last time. Next slide. So getting into a little more detail on the applicability, and really one of the important aspects is that we reached out to Drummond and Woodson to understand is the a legal interpretation of whether or not the Green New Deal applies to the BOF projects, and these projects in the sort of basis of what they are, a school function and city-owned buildings, that so that the ordinance applies to these projects. So then we get into what the requirements are, and there's a threshold currently in the Green Building Code for the City of Portland that says projects that are 10,000 square feet or more must meet certain standards. That threshold with the new language has been reduced to 5,000. That potentially has an impact, and we'll talk about what that is. But all of the projects in total are over 5,000 square feet. The difference is that the Reiki additions are less than 5,000 square feet. So again, we'll talk about that in a minute. So the better roof requirement would be applicable because of the 5,000 square feet, and also the energy improvement would change as well. And so the Green Building Code currently on the books already has a requirement to exceed the energy performance metric that's established by MUBEC, the Maine Uniform Building and Energy Code. And the Maine Uniform Building and Energy Code references the 2010 energy standard of ASHRAE 90.1. And so that is what we had been designing to. The change in the language says that you have to improve that percentage. The same percentage is 30% for a new building and 25% for existing buildings, but it now references the most recently published standard of ASHRAE 90.1, which is 2019. So that's a jump of a couple of versions of that energy standard. So there's been, and every time that standard is published, that increases the energy performance of buildings, and so that's where the big change is in coming in. So the current design, we've been in conversations with Thornton Tomasetti, as you all remember. They're doing our lead consulting for us, and they're doing the energy model on the projects. And in our conversation with them, the feeling is that our current design would not comply with the current version of the ASHRAE 90.1, the 2019. So that's the impact we think that the design is going to have to address. And the other component of understanding the applicability of the Green Building Code to the project is for renovation projects that the construction value would have to exceed the assessed value of the property, and the property being the value of the building and the site. And I think we all remember the Lyseth project. The property included both Lyman Moore and Lyseth, and so the construction value was not greater than or equal to that assessed value of the property, and therefore the Green Building Code wasn't a standard that needed to be met by the Lyseth project. But with these three school projects, the construction value does exceed the assessed value. So that's just another component that is why we have to comply with the requirements of this portion of the city ordinance. So next slide. And in particular, this is the terminology, and as it reads, and it says that, in quotes, all new construction and renovation projects to be owned or occupied by the City of Portland, or to be funded in whole or part by the City of Portland, that are of 5,000 square feet in floor area. And so there's sort of some aspect of that could be grounds for interpretation, and that's an aspect that we're trying to get clarification from the code enforcement department right now, because again, as the language reads, it says all new construction and renovation projects that are of 5,000 square feet in floor area. The question is, in some level of the interpretation, does that mean 5,000 square feet in the new portion of the work, or in the total portion of the work? And so that's sort of an area that we're trying to, because that has a big difference in terms of what we end up with for the application of the energy requirement for the projects.
Mark, if I could just
Pause for a second. Yes, please. Yep.
So renovation projects can include some new construction. So that's why this question arises, because you might be saying, well, if it covers renovation projects, why doesn't it cover that? Renovation projects can themselves include new construction under the definition. And so that's why the question arises, is it the 5,000 square feet that's new, whether a new construction project or a renovation project, or is it also the renovated area?
Thank you, Bill. Yeah, absolutely. So what does this mean? So one scenario would suggest if the interpretation is that the 5,000 square feet applies to the area, it doesn't matter if it's new or if it's a renovated area, that means that the new green building, the updates of the Green New Deal would apply to all three projects. And so that our scope of the design looks at really not a significant amount of improvements to the existing building envelope for any of the three schools, and as well as it doesn't address several of the mechanical systems in the existing areas of the three schools. And so the that portion of it is the thing that would be required to change with the Green New Deal, that we would have to improve the envelope of the existing areas of the buildings in all three and the mechanical systems in order to comply with the higher requirements of the energy code, the most recently published energy code. The second scenario is that if the 5,000 square feet is our threshold and it only applies to the new areas, as I mentioned, the Reiki additions are really that small addition for the entrance, and it has the an administration office area in a conference space that is added onto the front of the building, onto the Brackett Street side, and we also have the addition of the stair tower to access the where we're moving the health partner offices to. So those are the only two additions, and they don't add up to the 5,000 square feet. So presumably then, if the interpretation is that it really focuses around the new construction amounts, then the applicability is to Longfellow and Przemska. Scenario 3 is what if that threshold means that the application of the energy standard is only to the new areas, and in which case it wouldn't be the existing envelope in mechanical systems of Przemska and Longfellow. It would be the new areas of the additions, and so the addition in the front at Przemska and in the back, and then also Longfellow would be the classroom, and as shown right now, the cafeteria kitchen addition on the back of Longfellow. So that's an important distinction, because the new areas that we're doing have new mechanical systems for the most part and a much higher performing envelope, and so the lift to go from what we're currently designing to meet the 2019 energy standard isn't a significant amount. It may mean some additional insulation on the roof and walls, and maybe tweaks to the mechanical systems that we're designing to, but much less than having to put new insulation onto Reiki, or I'm sorry, in scenario 2, it'd be less in terms of the new insulation in the walls of Longfellow and roof of Longfellow, and new mechanical systems in Longfellow. Same thing with Przemska. So there's a big difference between 2 and 3 in that if it only applies to the new areas, then it's a significantly less investment or change to the design that we currently have. I'll pause for a moment here.
Anyone have any questions at the moment? Okay, Councilor Costa.
Yeah, so Mark, can you just reiterate again, how is that determination made, and is there an expected time frame for that?
So the determination, we believe, resides with the Code Enforcement Office from the City of Portland. So at The ordinance requires that at the time that we apply for the building permit, we have to demonstrate how we're going to comply with the elements or the requirements of the Green Building Code. And so, so that's when we have to have affidavits by the mechanical engineers that are designing the systems and the architects that's saying that we're going to be able to meet these. And then we also have to follow up prior to the certificate of occupancy. We have to show proof that we have met all those requirements. And so that's where the in some way the checks on our design side of it. So we believe that it exists there. And again, that our good folks from Drummond and Woodson can confirm their interpretation of that as well. We have been actively seeking an understanding from the Code Enforcement Office, but we're having a hard time getting a hold of them. And this is going on for some time now, and don't know if it's because that there's a reduction in hours, as well as there's a large amount of work that they're faced with. But so that's where we think it resides, the interpretation of which is scenario 1, scenario 2, or scenario 3.
And do we, either you or through Drummond Woodson, have an opinion about which is the most likely?
Yeah, I can speak to that. This is Aga Dixon. Hi, everybody. I think that what is most likely will depend on whether or not the code department has actually interpreted this language in the past. If you'll recall, the standard itself that was modified by question C is not a brand new standard. That's been in place for quite a while. But the two important changes that were made that implicate our projects is that the threshold for triggering this standard was dropped from 10,000 square feet to 5,000 square feet. And then, of course, the standard itself was changed from 2010 to the most recently published version of ASHRAE. And with respect to the drop from 10,000 to 5,000 square feet, I suspect that the city permitting department has had opportunity in the past to figure out its own interpretation of that. We can and we will make an argument that a reasonable interpretation of that is to only apply it to the new construction or the new additions. And I think that that's a reasonable interpretation. But if historically the city has interpreted that differently, it will be quite challenging to overcome that barrier. The second provision at issue here is going from 2010 ASHRAE to the most recently published version. And if you refer to our memo from October 28th, lawyers have a tendency to put the most important information in the footnotes. And so if you take a look at footnote 3, we kind of alluded to the fact that there's some real question about the legal validity of that kind of language in an ordinance. Typically, an ordinance has to be very clear about which version of which standard is adopted, especially if you're adopting a standard by cross-reference, like question C attempts to do here. So I think we have a pretty strong argument to say that, that switch from 2010 to the most recent version is legally invalid and not enforceable. And the city should revert back to using the standard that was in effect prior to the question C change. That's something that we will need to explore with Corporation Counsel and get them involved in. And if we get, if Danielle's team essentially agrees with our interpretation, we may be able to present that to the city permitting and inspection department, as well as the planning board, and overcome that hurdle without without waiting for them to interpret that issue. So that's much more of a pure legal issue.
Councilor Costa, you said?
I think so, but well, no, not quite. So then Mark, back to you, and maybe we're just about to get to this, but I guess then the question is, process-wise, how does this shake out? Is this, from the proverbial layperson's view, is this as simple as changing construction documents to reference a different standard, or is it more substantive in terms of the preparation of those documents?
It's an excellent question, and we'll move on to the next slide. But maybe so I think if you wait a minute, Justin, I think we can get to that.
Before we move on, I have a question from Councillor Ray. If that's all right with you, Mr. Costa?
Yep.
Okay. Councillor?
Thanks, Sarah. When you calculated the square footage for the Lyseth project, how did you do that? Did you include new construction and renovations?
Yeah, we did. Oh, go ahead, Aga.
That question was irrelevant to the Lyseth determination, because if you recall, the gatekeeper question on whether or not the green building code applies to any project is whether it qualifies as a new construction or a renovation, and it comes down exactly to the assessed value versus the construction costs. So we never had to reach this question of now that we're through that gate, how does the 5,000 square feet or previously the 10,000 square feet get interpreted?
But the reason that worked on Lyseth is because it was called a renovation. That's where that's written in?
No, the reason that it worked for Lyseth was because it was not a renovation project, because the assessed value did not exceed, the project construction cost did not exceed the assessed value. And here, all three projects do.
Doesn't that language about the assessed cost versus the value live in the renovation definition?
It does. Yeah. So you don't even get it, none of these standards even are even qualify as applying unless you are proposing new construction or a renovation project as is defined in that code. So Lyseth didn't qualify as a renovation project, so we never had to go to that second step of saying, okay, well now you're a renovation project, and now do you meet this 5,000 foot threshold?
Belinda, you're correct. Part of the analysis,
but these do.
You're correct. Part of the analysis was, is it a new project? And if I remember correctly, it wasn't a new project because of the renovations. So then you go to the renovation definition, which included this assessed value comparison.
Right. Okay. Well, I'll leave that there. My other question, actually, I guess it'll wait because I know we're going to get to talking about timeline. So I'll wait for that slide.
Thank you, Councillor. Any other questions at the moment? Okay. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. So the next slide, we start to outline a couple things. So really the lower portion of the slide is sort of in the worst case scenario one. I say worst case, it's simply not that it's worse, it's just that if it applies to all three projects, that the envelope upgrades and the mechanical system upgrades, these are a rough order of magnitude cost. We essentially calculated the exterior area of the building and applied factors of what were required to upgrade those, as well as looking at some of the mechanical systems that would have to be upgraded. So, and the tune of all three would be, estimated at this time to be about $6 million. Now, there's a lot of nuance to what is required. If you think about, and just to kind of talk about, Longfellow means that we've got to look at insulating the exterior walls of the building. That means that there's a fair amount of effort to look at where the insulation goes on the exterior wall. And that means taking all the interior finishes of all those exterior walls apart, understanding how we insulate them and also create air and moisture barriers in that. And so that's a pretty significant difference, because right now we're not really touching the exterior walls of the building. And so that's one example. Also, the exterior or the classrooms, the entire HVAC system is the exterior wall unit ventilators that just bring in fresh air, and they do have some pressure relief vents on the outside of the building that you can see sometimes. So that would be a very different project than what we have right now. And also, Presumpscot, same thing, that we weren't touching the exterior wall or the mechanical systems in the existing building. So, and then Reiki would be the biggest change if it's applicable to Reiki. The insulation would likely have to be on the outside of the building, and so that means radically changing the appearance, or potentially changing the appearance of Reiki, and with a new cladding system, and also new mechanical systems there too. So the rough order of magnitude for scenario one is all of those together at $6 million construction, which is approximately 16% of our budget. And so that means that we would have to refocus scope that we currently have in many of the other areas that we've identified, and sort of move that into those two items that really determine the energy performance of the building. If it's scenario two, then the threshold drops from, we take Reiki out of it, and so somewhere around $3.5 million that we would have to look at. And again, these are rough numbers. We have not done the design to understand what the total value is, but just to get an order of magnitude for us to consider the decisions. So scenario two would again be around the $3.5 million construction, not project. And then scenario three, if it's only the new additions of Presumpscot and Longfellow, then we think it's many orders of magnitude less. And so we think again that it's a minor modification to the current design. If we have to comply with scenarios 1 or 2, that really is a full redesign of at least 2 of the projects, if not all 3. So that pushes us into sort of really rethinking about, as we went, and as Javier talked about at the beginning, when we were going through this process in February, of trying to figure out what lens of equity we were going to use to apply to the BFOF projects, so that we were really trying to stay within the spirit of the original referendum, and we struggled with what that meant, and we worked hard as a group to identify that. This would mean kind of pausing and figuring out, okay, what further items do we remove from our current scope and put that into the new scope of the envelope and energy.
Mark, I have a question from Brad Post.
Mark. Assuming the worst case scenario, and that we've got to come up with this, would you say $6 million or something? Is there any possibility that some of this work might be deferred on the envelope or mechanical systems, 2, 3, 4 years down the road, where alternative financing might be figured out, and worked into the budget for these changes?
Yeah, thank you, Brad. I don't think right now, the way the ordinance is written, it allows you to postpone the improvements or somehow put them forward in time. Like I said, we have to submit an affidavit at the time that we apply for the building permit that says we are going to comply with it, and then we actually have to show proof at the time of trying to get the certificate of occupancy. And so, but I will defer to Drummond and Woodsum for their interpretation of that.
Yeah, I'll just say that's a really interesting question, and it's something we should check in on to see if there's a sequencing that will be allowed. But Mark is absolutely right. There is a provision in the Green New Deal question that basically requires us to certify and to having met that standard at the time of certificate of occupancy. So I think it's kind of a long shot, but it's worth asking if that could be, a condition of approval or a phased implementation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brad. Any further questions before we move on? Okay, go ahead, Mark. Thank you.
Very good. So I think at this point, Lisa, if we go to the next slide here, there is the question of whether or not we would be able to permit them within that 30-day window. That was sort of one of the considerations we were looking at the last time. We, as we think of where we were and are in the process of the design, it requires two components. There's the planning department review and approval, and that precedes the building, the code and plan review. And so at the time that Drummond and Woodson had written their opinion on the Green New Deal, we were feeling that the Longfellow and the Presumpscot, because of the nature of the additions that we were doing, would require a more extensive planning board review than the Reiki project, which we at that time understood that we would likely only require staff review. And then since then, we've updated as we were submitting to understand that no, we actually required a higher degree of review from planning, and so it's not just a staff review. And so all three have to go through the planning board, and that has a two-step process. One is that the planning department has to find that your application is complete under the requirements of the site plan reviews. And then there's a public hearing of the projects, and then there's the vote on approval for the site plan. After that, then the code enforcement, in fact, they will hold up their review, code enforcement, even if we applied for the building permit, they will hold up review until planning department signs off that they have approved the project. And so there's a sequencing to that. And so we would have to get planning approval and having the site or having our buildings submitted for permit review, and in that 30-day window. We have submitted all of the projects, and I think that's probably shown on maybe on our sequencing slides. And but we have submitted all three to planning. The problem is right now that the planning process is a somewhat slow process too. They have a lot of projects that are going through, and we aren't even on the agenda for this month, and so that essentially pushes us out, so that it makes it impossible for us to try to get in under that 30-day window.
Can I just say something on that? And I think we have a slide about this later. The board asked us to actually request expedited review from the city. So we are in the process of drafting correspondence to the city to that effect, and also asking for an interpretation on those other questions that we discussed, whether this is applicable to the projects, and if so, at what level, to all three projects, and so on. So, so two different prongs of inquiry with the city at this point. One around the possibility still of getting in under the implementation of the ordinance, which, as Mark indicated, seems highly unlikely, but I think we should be on the record asking for it. And then the other one is just the sort of the broad interpretation of to what extent is it applicable to us. And so Harriman and Drummond Woodson are working on that correspondence.
Thank you. Councilor Ray?
Yeah, so this is what I wanted to ask about. So the permits, you have begun the permit application process for all three?
With the site plan, yeah, with the planning board, yeah, yeah.
So you went into that horrendous portal and you uploaded all your documents, and did you pay an invoice fee?
Yes, that portion has been
okay. All right, so I do not want to create false hope, and nothing I say is obviously legally holding any water, but my experience has been that once you have submitted and you've paid your invoice, you are in the process. And I say this because we have instituted moratoriums that didn't apply to projects that had gotten only that far. Submitted the application and it was deemed complete enough to pay the invoice. So I would urge you to, I do have a question in to Planning and Corporation Council on this, and I think Corporation Council is very carefully examining this ordinance and trying to figure this all out. And I suspect that's why you haven't heard back from code enforcement, because they're not going to offer any kind of interpretation until they hear from Corporation Council. But this gives me hope, and I don't want to give others false hope. I could be wrong, but I think this is a really good thing. So if I hear anything, I will let you know, but I would urge you to ask that question. And there's a term for it. Christine Gramando, who's our planning director, it's provisionally approved, provisionally. Someone is, once you're at that point, then you are grandfathered to new ordinances. So I will continue to try to get that answer and get that to you, but I'm happy to know that the permits are in and the invoice is paid. I feel much better about that.
Thank you, Councilor. Any further questions at the moment? Okay, go ahead, Mark.
All right. So Lisa, next slide. So this is when I'll turn it over to Lisa to talk about a little bit of what we originally had proposed for and kind of what was guiding us along this process and where we are now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark. And great to see everyone this evening. This was our schedule prior to the Green New Deal being passed. The orange line you can see is approximately when the ordinance change will occur. And so just to walk folks through this chart, if you haven't seen it before, the green is planning board submissions. And so you can see when we've submitted to the planning board, the time frame to which that went in, and when we're trying to get on the docket for the planning board agenda was in this time frame right here, the week of November 9th and November 16th. That was the window that would essentially have been last week, this week or next week, to have enough time for us to be able to submit for the building permit. Again, the planning board has to be signed off on in order to get to that portion of the portal, if you will. And so that would mean that if that was able to happen, which is highly unlikely at this time, we would then be going out to bid with the projects ready to go with the current scope, starting with the Longfellow project the beginning of beginning of December. And then the Reiki project, about midway through, a little bit more than that, of January, and then the beginning of February for Presumpscot.
Can I say something on that, Lisa, real quick? Because I want to just get out in front of this. If you recall, at the last DABC meeting, there was, that was the first time that we introduced the concept of staggering these bids. And so there was, significant concern among, folks that are in this meeting today. So our intent prior to the Green New Deal passage was to today to have a substantive conversation about the recommendation, why we were suggesting that we stagger those. So, we're showing you the slide that shows how it was conceived, understanding, and I think it's important for you to understanding that it had not been fully vetted out with this group, something that we were intending to do today, which we obviously pushed back because we're not prepared to go to bid in the next month, given everything that we're looking at with the Green New Deal.
Thank you, Javier. That was definitely the intent of this meeting, to go over the logic behind that. And so right now, with the ordinance change happening here, is sort of where we're pausing at this moment to work through the detail of the ordinance, how it applies to these projects, and how we react to that to be able to get the projects modified if necessary and out on the streets. I'll pause there to see if there's any questions on the schedule. Okay. We did have a discussion with the board on Tuesday evening, bringing them up to speed on kind of where the projects were since the last time we met, and then the Green New Deal, and how that may impact the projects. The feedback that we got from the board is what you see here on the screen. And so they had asked, can we get an expedited review by the planning board, which Javier has spoken to, and that request is in, I believe. The district's council is working on getting a formal interpretation of the ordinance's impact as soon as possible. Consider moving forward with the Reiki project on the assumption that the changes won't apply to that school. And so I think we had addressed that at the board meeting, and there is risk with that. We don't know one way or the other if it will or will not apply. And so I think that's what Aga was talking about, trying to get clear interpretation on the square footage in regards to that. Communication with City Councilor Mayor Snyder about the decision to postpone the implementation of other referendum questions and determine applicability to question C. And so I know there's been a lot of conversation around that, and I don't know, Javier or Justin, if you wanted to speak to that. This is a question that came directly from the board meeting, and I know there's been subsequent conversations since then.
Yeah, I'm happy to weigh in, and Belinda, correct me if I say anything wrong, but that's just not on the table. There is no discretion for the council or the city to delay referendums. What's happening with the minimum wage one is a discussion of what the language of the referendum that was passed actually requires, and whether the requirement that was actually written into that takes effect at one time or another. But the ordinances are all passed, and they'll go into effect in 30 days, or 30 days from the ratification, that is.
Brad Post has a question as well.
I actually have two. I'm not sure it's quite the appropriate time, but one question is, would any of the general contractors that are bidding have the option to bid on more than one project? And then another question is, somewhere I read that there was some thinking about pushing out the bidding 6 months. And if we were to do that, Mark, is there a possibility that there might be a more competitive market with, the economy slowing down, potentially building slowing down in the future? But you could address these later or now.
Yeah, I think we'll hold those, Brad. I hopefully they've been captured, that because I think they do tie into a little bit different conversation, but I think they're appropriate and important. And so, but they kind of almost go with that staggering aspect that we were hoping to spend a little more time on tonight. But we can also address that certainly, yes, I guess in a very short, quick answer, yes, the intent is that general contractor can bid on multiple projects. And the second one is we'll talk a little bit about the staggering in the next slide.
Okay.
Brad, are you all set?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Ray?
Yeah, I just wanted to double down on what Justin said to make sure people understand that what's happening with question A is not a postponement. There's no ability for the council to do that. The city is interpreting it according to the plain language of the ordinance, and the plain language, as the city reads it, states that it takes effect in January of 2022. So it's not a council or city decision to postpone. That's what the city and the council believe the ordinance says. So we wouldn't be able to change implementation dates on anything, any of the others or that one. I just wanted to make sure that was clear.
Thank you, Councilor. Any other questions or comments? Okay. Moving on, Lisa or Mark?
So then next steps and discussion. So the next steps that we kind of outlined at this point, step one is to pause and evaluate the steps forward and determine the impact to the current scope at each school. And so that's actively what we're doing and chasing many avenues to do that. Step two will be review the options with the DABC. And so we need step one first to understand what those options are. And depending on what those options are, we may possibly, and these are just speculative, depending on what happens, we may delay all 3 schools about 6 months and spend that time to figure out what that scope is at each school and get them out on the street, or delay 1 school 6 months and maybe others longer. Again, all of this will really depend on how this applies to these schools. And then step 3 is a redesign of projects. So again, depending on what the outcome is and how this will apply depends on how much reworking of the projects will be required before these do go back or go out on the streets for bidding. And then after that is our upcoming meetings. And so the BLAC, November 19th, was moved up a week to avoid the holiday. So our next BLAC meeting falls on the Thanksgiving holiday. So this will be moved up to the 19th. And then our next DABC meeting will be December 17th. But I'll pause here. Looks like there's some questions.
Any questions from anyone? Comments?
I think Emily might have one.
I didn't see any hands up. Oh, sorry. Now I do. I'm sorry. Okay. Going to Ms. Vigdor.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to make one point with respect to the conversation tonight about grandfathering, the potential to grandfather these projects or otherwise the applicability of the environmental standards. We haven't been talking about the labor standards, which would apply in all cases. So I just wanted to make that distinction clear. We're talking about one part of the overall Green New Deal initiative.
And can I also just piggyback on that? And I think that we did talk about that when Mark presented. He talked about the impact of the labor components. And I think, he specifically spoke to the fact that we don't view those as particularly cumbersome for the project. And I do want to remind the DABC that the board did specifically ask that the LICEF project operate with fair contracting standards in place. So that has been the position of the board on those issues. The other provisions, the apprentice and OSHA, I think the apprentice could potentially limit the contractors that may be able to bid the projects. But otherwise, it's not particularly a cost issue. And OSHA, my understanding, and this is clearly, I'm out of my league, so I'll let Mark or others speak to that, is fairly standard practice in many contractors. So I think that's I think it's important to just point out that we did talk about it, but it's not something that is it's not part of the $6 million costs that we've laid out there.
Matthew Winch.
So I'd held this question till the end, and it's sort of ironic that there's some discussion on it now. The one question I had for Drummond and Woodsum related to the percentage of the workforce as apprentices. Javier touched on it about whether or not that would limit potential bidders or, frankly, interest from contractors that don't feel that they can meet that standard. But my overall question is there language or is there an understanding of what triggers are in effect if you can't physically meet the workforce percentage, meaning you can't, there has to be a labor pool an interested labor pool to actually fill that standard. And what if the labor pool is too shallow to fill that? And is there any clause or ability to maneuver around that after showing good faith that you've attempted to meet the workforce apprentice clause, and you can't hire any new individuals to bring into the trades?
So I can try to answer that. The language in the ordinance is mandatory. So it says that any firm awarded a city-funded contract of $50,000 or more has to comply with a certain set of standards, one of which is employ a certain minimum number of apprentices. And the number depends on essentially the date of contract award. There is no exception built into this provision of the code, but it is interesting that it's in the procurement code and it's not in the building code, for example. And I think that gives us some flexibility to read in some good faith requirements and to potentially, if this becomes a critical issue during bidding or as part of construction award, I think there are some ways that we could address the issue if indeed a good faith effort has been made to comply with this. And like you said, the applicant pool or the apprenticeship pool is dry or shallow.
All set, Matthew? Okay. Councillor Ray?
Yeah, I had a question along those lines too. I think that if we do fall into this, that we would be in the first step, which would require at least 10% of all persons employed on the job to be apprentices. And so my question was, how many people were employed on the LISEP project? Because it doesn't say, construction workers. It says all persons employed, 10% have to be apprentices. So do we know how many people that might be?
Yeah, and it's an interesting question, Councilor Ray. I'm trying to think. It fluctuates throughout the entire duration of the project, and so the question is, I guess, is it at the peak time when you get the most laborers on site, or is it simply just a sum total of individuals if you were to add them up? And haven't even sat down to sort of think about how many trades there are and how many people there have been on site for that. But that's certainly an exercise we could undertake to just understand the applicability of that. As I seem to recall, and I know that Drummond and Woods probably maybe have, but I think there is an aspect of the ordinance that says that there is something tied to the available number of apprentices in the language, but it may not have much of an impact. But I seem to recall there was something there, and I may not be correct.
There's also something to be said about who interprets this provision. Unlike the other portions of question C, which really rest with city departments for the most part and general counsel for the city, this falls squarely within the purview of the school board's interpretation. And, I think we could reasonably interpret this to mean employees of the general contractor and not subcontractors, because persons employed by the subcontractor are not folks employed on the project.
Why would that fall under the purview of the school board when it's written into the section about the city manager? This
gets to how the school board actually adopts its procurement code. So under the city code, the procurement rules apply to the city and are by reference apply to the school board. In previous legal opinions, and which we can share with you, is Ben Drummond Woodsum's opinion that the authority and right to adopt procurement policy rests with the for its school construction projects and other purchases rests with the school board. And it makes perfect logical sense for the school board to adopt the same policy as the city, but it doesn't have to as a matter of law. And so the school board does have, in our view, the authority to deviate from that policy if it wishes to do so. And it's certainly, even under the city code as it's written, the superintendent steps into the shoes of the city manager with respect to interpretations and applicability of the procurement code.
Okay.
You all set, Counselor?
Thank you.
Thank you. Jessica Marino?
I have a question, I think probably for you, Sarah. I'm wondering, since we're, as you said, sadly losing a city councilor and school board member from this committee, when is the school board appointing a new councilor and school board member, and will they be in place by December? And I guess I'm just thinking, because there is so much going on that we need input on the city side from, that I would hope that we would have, at least 2 city councilors on the committee as soon as possible.
Thank you. I'll have to consult with the superintendent and the chair, hopefully sooner than later, but I think we would have to have a conversation as well with Mayor Snyder.
Okay.
Thanks, Jess. Paul Stevens?
Yes, this is from Mark. If we end up having to delay this project to go out to bid by 6 months, aren't we going to have to anticipate some construction inflation and also anticipate the cost impact of going out to bid in what is generally considered a less favorable time? And is that factored into and I know that's a real rough number, but that $6 million?
Yeah, excellent question, Paul. And so and this gets a little bit, I think, to some of the one of the questions that Brad was raising. And so we potentially would incur escalation in construction costs, as we have seen, and this project seems to have really felt the impact of that escalation. It doesn't happen at a moment in time. It happens gradually, and so there's sort of inflationary pressures and factors that occur at multiple times. We were targeting this time of year to bid for several reasons. One, it is traditionally, in fact, we were on the front end of it here, trying to get the stuff out. Traditionally, when there's less work out contracted, and that contractors are starting to line up their work for as it breaks in the season. So the spring work would be bid in early in the year, and so So that's why we were targeting this time frame. We have the sliding of the projects would potentially incur additional escalation. We don't know how much. We haven't factored that into that $6 million. So that does not include some loss of the value of the scope by delaying it. The other component to when we factored the starting of these projects had to do with the calendar, the construction calendar, and how that aligned with the school calendar. And so by moving it 6 months, we haven't chased through the impact of how that would have on the construction duration. But what we're trying to do is by starting in the springtime or late spring, is that you have the full use of the summer. And that's important because that's when the buildings aren't occupied and you can get more work done. So thinking that you're bidding it 6 months from now, you lose the time of that summer that really does have an impact on the phasing of the projects. So we think that has to be chased through in understanding and delay and how that it would change.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you. Board Member Figdor?
Thank you. Just to go back to the conversation about the labor standards, the school board's already chosen to, as we talked about, write the prevailing wage requirements into the RFP for LISEF. We already acknowledge that we want these schools to be built in a way that supports the workers in our community. And I would say the same from my perspective, would be true with respect to these new requirements for apprentices. There's a reason for those requirements. They support the next generation of our workers. And I know from my perspective as a school board member, I would want to comply with those and not look for a way to minimize those requirements. They're there because of the value that those apprenticeships can provide for our community as we move forward.
Councilor Costa?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. So first question, I guess, when we talk about the interpretation of this and thinking through it, the question for Drummond, I guess, is does anyone outside of the city or schools have any ability to challenge anything?
That's a great question. I think the legal interpretation of the ordinance itself, if we were to, for example, ask corporate counsel, as we intend to do, whether that 2019 ASHRAE standard is legally valid, it comes down to a question of standing, but any aggrieved party could challenge that interpretation on a number of grounds. With respect to the permitting and planning division interpretations that we hope to receive, those could be challenged by an aggrieved party, which is effectively any abutter or neighbor of the project, and aggrieved parties for purposes of municipal land use matters have been broadly interpreted by the Maine Law Court to include quite a few other groups. So, for example, environmental organizations with whose membership includes residents of Portland would probably qualify as well. So there are quite a few people who could challenge that if they participated in those local permitting proceedings.
So, I mean, obviously what I'm getting at is trying to figure out how we try to evaluate the likelihood of each of the scenarios. And I think, obviously it's not something we can determine, but that will be in the background then, that if the determination is something less then the roughly $6 million tag, I think the school department has to be prepared for the possibility that that could get challenged, not because it's specifically geared at these projects, but it'll be about the general rule and how the city is going to interpret those provisions of the code, which were enacted. So that to me seems significant and something that the school department will have to think about. And I think my only other major question was basically asked by Paul. So I think I'm okay for now.
Can I follow that up for Aga and Bill in particular? So in the rosiest scenario, which is it's better than the scenario 3 that we laid out, one where sort of what Councilor Ray sort of said that because the permitting is already in play, that the projects are grandfathered in. Would there be a recourse for an aggrieved party? So would the proponents of the ordinance or others, broadly interpreted as you mentioned, have a reason to challenge that?
Mm-hmm. I think the answer is that it takes very little to have a reason to challenge something when it comes to land use matter before reviewing authority. So if somebody wanted to gum up the works and delay a project, they could certainly file what's called a Rule 80B appeal, and that process would result in delays. Unless, at any point, at any juncture during this inquiry and the decision-making on the permitting, Portland Public Schools could simply say, well, never mind, we're just going to move forward and comply with the Question C requirements. So that's always a way to take that specter off the table, the specter of delay off the table. But to get to your question, I think people could try to challenge it. Whether they're successful is a separate question, but the effort to file a lawsuit or file an appeal it is not a high burden for these projects.
First of all, I apologize. I don't see my raise hand function even when I hit the little ellipsis.
That's okay. Go ahead, Bill.
What's a little bit different, and I think Javier is alluding to this, is it's one thing to say, well, never mind, but in a process where you have to go through competitive bidding and not knowing when this challenge, or maybe you could address when this challenge might come, because at some point we're sort of headed down a pathway that we can't really turn back from very well. So do you know, Aga, offhand, at what point?
Yeah, I think the first indicator would be if there were any opponents participating in the public hearing on the site plan review. If that were the case, then I think the prospect of an appeal is raised. If there are no opponents participating, then nobody will be successful in filing an appeal. You do have to participate in the hearing.
And Mark, at that point, you haven't had to worry about doing a lot of different design work, or?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
The unique situation here is that most of the standards that we're referring to are implicated not at the site plan review phase, but really at the subsequent building permit phase. So I just want to caveat that we could get fairly far along this process without knowing if there's significant opposition to pursuing, an interpretation of the ordinance or seeking a waiver to avoid meeting the ASHRAE standard for one or more of these projects. I think we will have an indicator of opposition though early on in the site plan review phase. And we can do some strategizing separately to think through what we could do to sort of flush that out earlier. One thought that I have is that, this ordinance is not perfectly crafted, and there's some ambiguity about who makes certain decisions about waivers, for example, of the green building code. So there is some overlap between the code enforcement officer's role as well as the planning director's role. And we may want to invoke that if for no other reason than to identify, any opposition, for example.
Thank you. Board Member Figdor?
I wonder, it's a very challenging situation given that it appears that we might not have the legal interpretation we need from different city bodies as soon as we would like. So I guess my question is, my understanding is we've kind of stopped working on the projects. I know the site plans have been submitted, but otherwise my understanding is that we've stopped kind of the final production of the construction documents and perhaps other work that needs to get done. And I'm wondering, when do we, how and when do we decide, okay, we want to try and move these projects forward because otherwise we're gonna lose time. I see it both ways. We don't want to spend time on projects that we're finalizing projects that we're then going to have to go back to the drawing board and redesign. But on the flip side, we might just wait and lose the time we need in order to get in this construction cycle. So how are we going to make that determination?
Mark, can you speak to where we are with the projects and what would be the next, so if this had not happened, what would we be working on now? And so let's start with that.
Sure, absolutely. So and every project has a slightly different scope, but they were paused at approximately 75 to 80% complete in terms of the design. So it was in the very last stages of getting them ready to bid. The first one, as we had shown on the chart, was intended to bid in December. And so right now we've lost some time because of the pause here. And so the other component that kind of goes hand in hand with, and that's, again, as we discussed earlier, was going to be the focus of tonight's meeting, is understanding this staggered approach and really having a conversation with this committee on the merits of doing that. Part of that is also, as we presented before, a qualification process for the contractors. And what we wanted to do this time around is say we're going to go out and do a pre-qualification solicitation and then vet a pool of contractors to bid on any of the projects. The challenge, if we decide to move forward with that pre-qualification process, is that right now we have an indeterminate time frame from when we would ask them to bid on the projects, and so that complicates that a bit. But that's really the permitting piece is that we're underway, the planning board, and then what we traditionally do is wait until we are complete the documents to submit them for the code enforcement planning review. And so that looked at the building code side of it, not the site review. But that traditionally we wait until the documents are at that 100% phase, because that's when everything is accounted for in the documents, and they're going to do their review and look for compliance with the code at that time. So all of that, the procurement of, or the solicitation for the general contractor pre-qualification, and then submission of the building permit application, and those are really the two phases that we had targeted to begin in with the first project in December, and right now that pushes out certainly a couple weeks, and until we sort of understand the applicability, that's kind of what has paused. If we get a determination in the next week or so that we can continue moving forward with the scope that we originally had identified, then we probably have lost about a month in our process, and we would continue moving forward. So that's kind of the best case scenario, I think, that we would sort of slide everything by about a month.
Can you tell me why we stopped the pre-qualification of contractors? I was not aware of that. I discussed that with Steve the other day, and I understood that we were proceeding with that.
Yeah, the challenge is that we're asking contractors to submit an interest in a project that has a scope and a defined time frame. And right now, the time frame is indeterminate, and the scope right now would be indeterminate as well.
Councilor Costa?
Thanks, Sarah. So just to close the loop on the previous thread that I was bringing up, I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly, and then everyone else can understand correctly, because I think the risk in planning for these projects, it's not just a challenge to our particular projects. What's going to be up for discussion in a variety of forums is how these basic terms in the newly enacted ordinance are going to be interpreted, right? So that rule could come from how they're interpreted and applied to our project or any other project that meets the square footage and other requirements. Is that correct?
Those are, I'll go again, my memory is the ordinance is limited to City of Portland projects, right? But yes, on that understanding.
Yeah, it's not clear to me, Justin, whether there are any other city-owned or city-funded projects before permitting or planning that would, raise these legal questions that we're tossing around here. So I'm not entirely sure that's the case. Mark, maybe you know what the queue is and whether any big projects like this are in front of the board.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any others right now that are.
Okay, that's helpful then. So thank you.
Okay. Mark, do you want to wrap things up?
Absolutely. So I think that's kind of our, as was mentioned, Lisa said that really our next steps are the BLAC meetings, and essentially what we're going to do is just bring them up to speed to where things are at this time, continue to pursue in concert with council the interpretation aspects and the various conversations that we've had tonight, and that our next meeting is on December 17th. And so we should know a lot more at that time. And if I suspect if anything happens of substance before that time, then we'll probably circle the group, and if we need a special meeting, we can pull that together. I think we're also trying, on a sort of a brighter note, we're trying to organize a BLAC meeting and tour for the Lyseth project in and around November, December as well. There's been a lot of really great progress for that, and it's exciting to see that come together too. So I think in some ways that it helps elevate our spirits when we get thinking about the challenges that we face and sort of how we overcame a lot of that and the really amazing changes at that school. So that's what we have planned tonight, and I appreciate everyone's involvement and effort here.
Any last minute questions from anybody? Okay.
Mark, maybe Aga and I and you could talk tomorrow about who's taking the lead on that letter and give Javier a time frame for when we might have a draft of that.
Absolutely, Bill. Yep, sounds like a great idea.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Agi, for being with us this evening. appreciate your time.
Thank all of you.
Thank you.
Very much. Okay. So with that, do I have a motion for adjournment?
So moved.
Councilor Ray, seconded by
Second.
Board Member Victor. All those in favor of adjourning at 7:30, please indicate. Okay. Good night. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.